The Adventure of the Caledonian Cache. It was one of those raw, penetrating evenings in late autumn when the fog of London seems to possess a life of its own. A thick, yellow miasma that rolls in from the Thames, swallowing the gas lamps and muffling every sound until the great city appears half dream, half nightmare. From our windows at 221B Baker Street, little could be discerned save the blurred glow of streetlights and the occasional shadowy shape of a hansom cab emerging from the murk like some spectral beast. I had spent the day at my practice and returned to find Holmes in one of his contemplative moods. He reclined in his old red armchair, legs stretched toward the crackling fire, a cloud of blue smoke from his black shag tobacco curling about his hawk-like profile. The room was in its customary disorder: chemical apparatus on the deal table, unanswered correspondence pinned to the mantel with a jackknife, and a pile of recent newspapers strewn across the floor. Holmes himself, dressed in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, had been silent for hours, his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin as he pursued some chain of reasoning visible only to himself. I had just settled into my own chair with a medical journal when the bell rang below, a sharp, decisive peal that cut through the muffled stillness. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended the 17 stairs with her usual measured tread, and presently she appeared at the door. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "A foreign gentleman, Count Vladislav Draculea. He says the matter is most urgent and will not be denied." Holmes's eyes brightened with that sudden gleam I had come to recognize as the harbinger of interest. "Draculea," he repeated softly, as though tasting the name. "A name redolent of ancient Wallachian nobility. Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson." Our landlady withdrew, and a moment later the visitor was ushered in. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with a dignified, almost stately bearing that spoke of centuries of breeding. His travelling cloak, still damp with fog, hung heavily from broad shoulders, and beneath it he wore evening dress of impeccable cut. His face was striking, pale, aquiline, with high cheekbones, a firm mouth, and dark eyes that burned with intelligence and a hint of melancholy. A thin moustache and pointed beard completed the impression of Eastern European aristocracy. Though his English was perfect, it carried the faint musical lilt of his native tongue. He bowed with old-world courtesy, first to Holmes and then to myself. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, I am Count Vladislav Draculea of Transylvania. I have travelled from Bucharest expressly to place before you a problem that has baffled the finest scholars of Europe. Forgive my intrusion at this late hour, but time presses, and I have been assured that you, sir, are the one man who might resolve it." Holmes waved him to the basket chair opposite his own. "Pray be seated, Count, and divest yourself of that cloak. The fire is warm. Dr. Watson is my friend and colleague. Anything you say may be spoken freely before him. A glass of whisky to ward off the damp?" The Count accepted both chair and whisky with a murmured expression of thanks, then drew from an inner pocket a flat leather case. From this he carefully extracted a roll of parchment, yellowed and fragile with age, its edges frayed and its surface marked by many foldings. "This," he said, unrolling it upon the occasional table beneath the gas lamp, "is the cause of my journey. It is a map, or more accurately a series of cryptic directions, passed down in my family since the middle of the 18th century. My great-grandfather, a supporter of the exiled Stuart cause, gave sanctuary to a Highland officer fleeing the aftermath of Culloden. In gratitude, or perhaps as payment for passage to the continent, the Jacobite presented him with this document. He claimed it led to a treasure concealed in the Scottish Highlands during the Roman occupation, a relic hidden beyond the Great Northern Wall, as the verse has it." Holmes leaned forward eagerly. All trace of languor vanished. He adjusted the powerful lens he kept upon the table and bent over the parchment, his thin, eager face illuminated by the gaslight. For several minutes he studied it in silence, tracing the faded Latin inscriptions. the curious interlaced Celtic symbols, boars, knots, and stylized eagles, and the faint diagrams that appeared to represent constellations. "Extraordinary," he murmured at last. "The calligraphy is consistent with the 2nd century, though the parchment itself may be later. Note the watermark, almost certainly 18th century continental. The Latin verses are elegant but deliberately obscure. Aquila amissa ultramurum ubi aper silvestris vigilat. The eagle lost beyond the wall, where the wild boar keeps watch." And these astronomical references, pointers to Polaris and the summer solstice, suggest alignment with ancient standing stones. The trail appears to commence from a monolith north of London, possibly the London stone itself, or one of the Hertfordshire menhirs, and proceeds along old Roman roads toward the Antonine frontier, ending, I suspect, in the Cairngorms. He laid down the glass and fixed the Count with his penetrating gaze. "You wish me to decipher this map fully, and should the directions prove valid, to recover whatever lies at their conclusion?" "Exactly so," replied Draculea, leaning forward earnestly. "Monetary value, if any exists, is of secondary importance. It is the historical significance that compels me. Roman penetration so far into Caledonia is poorly documented. A deliberate hoard from that era would be of incalculable scholarly worth. Should we succeed, I give you my word that the entire discovery shall be donated intact to a British museum, perhaps the National Museums of Scotland. But the riddles have defeated every antiquary to whom it has been shown. I am told, Mr. Holmes, that your methods transcend ordinary scholarship." Holmes smiled, that thin, enigmatic smile I knew so well. "A flattering tribute, Count, and one not wholly undeserved when the problem is sufficiently intricate. This is indeed a 3-pipe puzzle at the very least, perhaps more. I accept the commission with pleasure. Watson," he turned to me with sudden energy, "you will accompany us, I trust. The bracing Highland air will invigorate you after the fogs of London, and I may have need of your steady hand and revolver should the terrain prove difficult." I assured him of my willingness, and thus, on that fog-bound autumn evening, was launched one of the most singular and intellectually satisfying adventures of Sherlock Holmes's career. An affair in which no criminal agency threatened us, yet which taxed his extraordinary faculties to their utmost and carried us at last into the wild and mist-shrouded heart of the ancient Caledonian mountains. The morning following Count Draculea's visit dawned clear and frosty, a welcome relief after the stifling fog of the previous evening. I awoke to find Holmes already astir, the sitting-room transformed into a veritable cartographic laboratory. The breakfast table had been cleared and pushed aside. In its place lay spread a chaos of maps, charts, and reference volumes borrowed from the British Museum and his own extensive shelves. The ancient parchment occupied the centre, weighted at its corners with volumes of Gibbon and Mommsen, to prevent its curling edges from obscuring the cryptic inscriptions. Around it were arrayed modern ordnance survey sheets, detailed maps of Hertfordshire, the Midlands, Northumberland, and the Scottish Highlands, together with older county maps from the 18th century, and even reproductions of Ptolemy's Geographia and the Antonine Itinerary. Pipes, tobacco pouches, and half-empty coffee cups completed the scene, while the air was thick with the aroma of strong Turkish blend Holmes, favoured for intensive mental work. Count Draculea arrived promptly at 10, his tall figure filling the doorway as Mrs. Hudson showed him up. He had exchanged his travelling cloak for a well-cut morning coat, but the same earnest intensity animated his pale features. Holmes greeted him with that quick, bird-like tilt of the head that signified his mind was already racing ahead. "Come in, Count. Come in. You find us deep in the chase already. Watson, pray pull up another chair. We have much to discuss." I complied, and soon the three of us were gathered about the table, while Holmes, with his long forefinger, began tracing connections across the bewildering array of documents. "You will observe," he began, his voice vibrant with suppressed excitement, "that the parchment is not a map in the conventional sense. No coastlines or rivers are depicted. but rather a sequence of directional verses, each accompanied by symbolic markers. The opening stanza, in somewhat archaic Latin, A lapide Londini septentrionem versus ubi via Romana antiqua bifurcat, from the stone of London northward, where the ancient Roman road divides, clearly refers to the London stone in Cannon Street as the starting point, though the true commencement lies some miles beyond, at a surviving menhir near St Albans. The boar symbol here confirms it, the Caledonian boar, emblem of the northern tribes who traded with Roman auxiliaries. He moved his finger northward across the modern map. The trail follows Ermine Street and Dare Street, principal Roman arteries, pausing at successive points marked by astronomical alignments. This reference to the bear's tail pointing toward the wall at midsummer indicates a sighting from Corbridge toward Hadrian's frontier. And here, he tapped a faint constellation sketch, the eagle in ascent, visible only from the northern slopes of the Cheviots. Each stage is verified by cross-referencing with known Roman mileposts and surviving antiquities. The Count leaned forward, his dark eyes alight. Remarkable, Mr. Holmes. Continental scholars dismissed these as mere decorative flourishes. Scholars, replied Holmes dryly, often see what they expect to see, but observe the progression. After the wall, the directions become more oblique, employing Pictish symbols and Gaelic place names disguised in Latinized form. The penultimate verse, Ubi aquila nidificat in Gula Montis, where the eagle nests in the throat of the mountain, combined with this stylized corrie and loch, points unmistakably to a hidden recess in the Cairngorms near Loch Morlich. The final marker will be a carved Roman eagle upon the rock itself. He straightened, reaching for his pipe and filling it with deliberate care. The hoard, whatever its nature, was concealed by a Roman officer, likely of the 20th Legion, during one of the abortive northern campaigns under Septimius Severus around AD 208 to 211. The collection appears to have been deliberate, not mere payroll coinage dumped in haste, but a curated selection, perhaps intended as diplomatic gifts to Caledonian chieftains or a personal retirement fund. It was later discovered by your Jacobite ancestor, who reburied it with this guide for safekeeping amid the turmoil following Culloden. I could not suppress my admiration. Holmes, you have reconstructed the entire history from a few faded lines and symbols. A simple matter of synthesis, Watson. The parchment's provenance, the 18th century watermark, the Jacobite associations, combined with the 2nd century Latin and authentic Caledonian motifs, admit of no other interpretation. The Count expressed his profound gratitude, but Holmes waved it aside. The intellectual challenge is reward enough. We must now prepare for the journey itself. The terrain in the Cairngorms is rugged. We shall require sturdy boots, alpenstocks, and provisions against inclement weather. I propose we depart on the night train to Edinburgh tomorrow, thence by local conveyance northward. He rose and crossed to the mantel where his deerstalker and travelling cape hung ready. Selecting his favourite ash-plant alpenstock from the umbrella stand, he tested its balance with a practised swing. Watson, you will bring your service revolver, I trust? Not that I anticipate human interference. Our only adversaries will be the elements and the passage of time. But prudence is ever wise. Count, your local knowledge of mountainous terrain will prove invaluable. Thus the morning passed in detailed planning, routes marked in red ink upon the ordnance sheets, timetables consulted, telegrams dispatched for accommodation in Aviemore. By luncheon the entire trail stood revealed before us, a chain of logical deduction stretching from the heart of London to the wild fastnesses of Caledonia. As we parted until the morrow, I could not help reflecting how characteristic this was of my friend, to transform an ancient enigma into a precise itinerary through the application of pure reason. Little did I suspect, as we packed our portmanteaus that evening, that the greatest test would come not from deciphering the map, but from the perilous natural barrier guarding the final secret. Our departure from London was accomplished with that precision which Holmes invariably brought to every undertaking. We met Count Draculea at King's Cross Station on the evening appointed and boarded the night express for Edinburgh with compartments reserved in advance. The platform was thronged with the usual medley of travellers, commercial gentlemen with sample cases, families returning north for the Christmas season, and a sprinkling of military officers on leave. But our party attracted little notice as we settled into our seats. The train pulled out punctually at 10 o'clock, and soon the lights of London were left behind. Holmes, ever restless when in motion, spread the parchment and his annotated maps upon the small folding table and reviewed the earlier clues by the dim glow of the compartment lamp, though he had long since committed them to memory. The Count, seated opposite, gazed thoughtfully out at the passing darkness, while I, lulled by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, dozed intermittently until dawn. With morning came the pleasant English countryside, hedge-rowed fields silvered with frost, church spires rising from clustered villages, and occasional glimpses of ancient barrows upon the downs. Our first verification came near St. Albans, where we broke our journey briefly to inspect the standing stone indicated in the opening verse. Holmes alighted with alpenstock in hand, striding across the frozen meadow to the weathered men here, while the train waited at a nearby siding, a courtesy arranged by telegram. A few moments' examination of the boar carving upon its northern face sufficed to confirm his deductions, and we reboarded well satisfied. The journey continued northward along the great Roman arteries, Ermine Street and Dare Street, though now concealed beneath modern railways and turnpikes. At each major stage, Holmes pointed out correspondences. A milestone near York, a fragment of tessellated pavement unearthed beside the line, the alignment of certain constellations visible from particular viaducts. The Count proved an attentive listener, contributing occasional insights drawn from continental archaeology, while I contented myself with observing the changing landscape, the gentle Midlands giving way to the rolling hills of Yorkshire, and those in turn to the wilder moors of Northumberland. We paused for a full day at Hexham, hiring a dog-cart to convey us to several sites along Hadrian's Wall. The Great Barrier stretched across the rugged countryside like the spine of some prehistoric monster, its stones weathered but defiant after 17 centuries. Holmes walked briskly along a section near Housesteads, noting the positions of mile castles and turrets, with reference to the parchment's astronomical clues. "Here," he remarked, standing upon the wall and sweeping his arm toward the north. The Roman advance halted for a generation. Yet Severus pushed beyond, into the very heart of Caledonia, farther than any emperor before or after. It was during one such expedition, I believe, that our hoard was concealed. The Count nodded gravely. The parchment speaks of retreat and concealment, a defeated column, perhaps, burying its treasures against recapture by the tribes. Precisely, and later rediscovered by a Jacobite fugitive familiar with these northern wilds. From Hexham we pressed on by rail through the lowlands, the scenery growing ever more austere. The fertile fields of England were now replaced by sweeping moorland, dotted with sheep and crossed by stone dikes. The border hills rose darkly against the sky, and occasional ruins of peel towers reminded us of older feuds than even Rome's. At Edinburgh we changed to the Highland line, hiring a private carriage at Perth for the final stages, as the railway did not yet penetrate the heart of the Cairngorms. The road wound upward through Glentilt and past Blair Athol, the mountains closing in about us like silent guardians. Snow lay upon the higher peaks, and the air grew keen and resinous with the scent of pine. Throughout the journey, conversation turned frequently to historical matters. Holmes discoursed learnedly upon Roman tactics north of the Wall, citing passages from Tacitus and the Notitia Dignitatum, while the Count recounted legends of his own Carpathian homeland, tales of ancient Dacian strongholds that drew intriguing parallels. I confess I contributed little beyond occasional questions, content to watch the landscape transform from pastoral England to the stern grandeur of Scotland. No hint of human antagonism marred our progress. Our only challenges were logistical: the occasional delay for snow upon the line, the need to verify obscure landmarks against the parchment's riddles. Each confirmation strengthened Holmes's conviction that we followed a true path laid down 1700 years before. At length, after several days of steady northward travel, we reached the village of Aviemore, nestled at the foot of the Cairngorms proper. Here we engaged rooms at a modest inn and hired ponies and a local guide familiar with the higher corries. The great mountains loomed ahead, granite peaks capped with early snow, their lower slopes cloaked in dark forests of Scots pine, while mist-wreathed lochs glinted in the valleys below. Holmes stood upon the inn's threshold that evening, gazing upward with keen anticipation. "Tomorrow, gentlemen," he said quietly, "we shall confront the final enigma, the eagle's nest in the throat of the mountain. I confess I look forward to it with uncommon interest." Thus ended our journey northward, a pilgrimage along ancient ways that linked the imperial ambition of Rome with the wild spirit of Caledonia, a fitting prelude to the intellectual and physical trial that awaited us in the high corries. We left Aviemore early on a crisp December morning, the sky a pale cloudless blue and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Our small party, Holmes, Count Draculea, myself, and a sturdy Highland gillie named MacDonald, who knew every corrie and burn within 20 miles, set out on sturdy ponies along a narrow track that wound upward through the ancient Caledonian forest. The scent of pine and peat rose about us, and the only sounds were the soft thud of hooves on the frosted path, the occasional cry of a raven overhead, and the distant rush of a mountain stream. The forest gradually thinned as we climbed, giving way to open moorland clothed in heather now browned by winter. Snow lay in patches upon the higher ground, and the great granite peaks of the Cairngorms rose ahead like the battlements of some primordial fortress. Loch Morlich glinted below us, its waters dark and still beneath a thin skim of ice along the margins. Beyond it, the northern corries were already gathering shadows as the pale sun climbed the sky. Holmes rode in silence for the most part, his keen eyes constantly scanning the landscape, comparing every ridge and hollow with the final cryptic indications upon the parchment. From time to time he would dismount to examine a cairn or a weathered outcrop, tracing faint markings with sensitive fingertips or consulting his pocket compass. The Count, though clearly unaccustomed to such rugged travel, maintained a dignified composure, while MacDonald, a taciturn man of few words, guided us unerringly toward the particular corrie Holmes had identified. By midday we had reached a high shelf above the loch, where the track dwindled to a sheep path. Here we tethered the ponies and continued on foot, packs upon our backs containing provisions, lanterns, and a short crowbar. The air had grown noticeably colder. Our breath hung before us in clouds, and a keen wind swept down from the snowfields above. At last, after another hour of steady ascent, we emerged into the corrie itself, a vast, bowl-shaped hollow carved by ancient glaciers, its floor scattered with boulders and its encircling walls sheer granite precipices streaked with rime. A narrow loch lay at the bottom, its surface mirror-still and reflecting the surrounding peaks. Mist clung to the higher crags, drifting in slow wreaths that lent the scene an almost supernatural aspect, as though we had stepped into one of the old Gaelic tales of hidden glens and vanished warriors. Holmes halted at the corrie's edge and unfolded the parchment once more. "We are arrived," he announced quietly. "Observe the configuration. The loch shaped like the head of a boar, the three prominent buttresses corresponding to the symbolic triad upon the map. The final verse, Ubi aquila nidificat in gula montis, where the eagle nests in the throat of the mountain, refers to that narrow cleft upon the eastern face. He pointed with his alpenstock to a sheer cliff rising almost vertically from the loch's farther shore. Halfway up, scarcely visible against the grey granite, a darker fissure opened, a natural cave mouth concealed by overhanging rock and clumps of heather. Leading to it, etched faintly upon the cliff like a scar, ran a narrow ledge, no more than a foot or 18 inches in width, winding along the face for perhaps 20 meters before vanishing into the shadow of the cleft. I felt a chill that was not entirely due to the mountain air. The drop from that ledge to the rocks and icy water below must have been fully 300 feet. Loose scree and frost-heaved fragments littered the path, and in places the granite had crumbled away entirely, leaving treacherous gaps. "Extraordinary," murmured the Count, shading his eyes. "A natural fortress. No wonder the hoard has remained undisturbed these 17 centuries." MacDonald, practical Highlander that he was, shook his head doubtfully. "Yon's no path for mortal man in winter, sir. The frost loosens the stones and the wind comes roaring down the corrie like a banshee." Holmes, however, was already studying the ledge through his pocket glass. "The danger is undeniable," he conceded, "but the construction of the final clue suggests that the Romans themselves used this route, perhaps a scouting party or a single officer seeking a secure hiding place. The ledge is narrow, but negotiable with care. We shall proceed single file, testing each step. I shall lead, MacDonald shall bring up the rear with the rope. Watson, your steady nerves will be invaluable." We rested briefly upon a flat boulder, eating a cold luncheon of oatcakes and cheese while Holmes outlined the procedure. The rope would be coiled about our waists at intervals, providing some safeguard against a total fall. Lanterns and tools would be carried in packs, leaving hands free for the rock face. The sun, though low, still gave sufficient light. We dared not attempt the traverse in gathering darkness. As we prepared to descend toward the loch's edge, I could not help feeling a thrill of apprehension mingled with excitement. Throughout our long journey we had faced no human adversary, only the intellectual challenge of the parchment and the ordinary discomforts of travel. Now, at the very threshold of discovery, nature herself presented the final, most formidable barrier, a crumbling path upon a precipice where one false step would mean certain death. Holmes, catching my glance, smiled faintly. "Courage, Watson. The game is nearly won. Remember that the greatest perils often come not from criminal design, but from the impartial indifference of the elements." With that, he adjusted his deerstalker, gripped his alpenstock, and began the careful descent toward the foot of the cliff. We followed in silence, the mist swirling about us and the dark mouth of the cave waiting high above like the entrance to some forgotten realm of antiquity. With the loch gleaming darkly at the foot of the cliff and the mist swirling in slow eddies about the higher crags, we commenced the most hazardous portion of our adventure, the traverse of that narrow, crumbling ledge which alone gave access to the hidden cave. Holmes, as he had proposed, took the lead. He adjusted the rope about his waist, securing it with a practiced bowline knot, and gripped his alpenstock firmly in his right hand, while pressing his left palm flat against the cold granite for balance. Without a backward glance, he stepped onto the ledge, his lean figure outlined sharply against the void. "Follow at 10-foot intervals," he called back, his voice calm and precise. "Test each footfall before committing your weight. Keep your eyes upon the rock face, not the drop below." I watched as he advanced with that extraordinary steadiness which characterized all his movements. The ledge, scarcely wider than a man's boot in places, sloped gently outward, and loose scree shifted treacherously beneath his tread. Fragments of granite, dislodged by frost and time, rattled down into the abyss, their faint echoes returning long seconds later from the loch far beneath. The wind, funneling through the corrie, plucked at his cape and threatened to unsteady him, yet he progressed with methodical caution, probing each step with the ferrule of his stick before trusting his full weight. MacDonald, our gillie, waited until Holmes had covered half the distance before signalling me to follow. I confess that my heart beat faster than usual as I stepped onto the path. The granite was icy beneath my gloved hands, and the outward tilt of the ledge gave one the constant sensation of sliding toward the edge. I fixed my gaze upon Holmes's retreating back, concentrating upon the rhythm of his progress. One cautious step, pause, probe, another step, until my own movements fell into the same deliberate pattern. Behind me I heard the Count's measured breathing as he began the traverse, and MacDonald's low Gaelic encouragement. The rope between us provided some psychological comfort, though I knew that should one man fall, the sudden jerk might drag the others after him. Yet the discipline of the moment held. No one spoke, save for occasional brief warnings from Holmes ahead. "Loose stone here," or "mind the gap," his voice carrying clearly despite the wind. The 20 meters seemed interminable. At one point the ledge narrowed to less than a foot, with a frost-shattered section where only a thin crust of rock remained. Holmes negotiated it by pressing his body close to the cliff and sidling crabwise, his alpenstock held horizontally for balance. I followed suit, feeling the void yawn beneath my heels and the cold sweat upon my brow despite the winter air. The Count, less accustomed to such exposure, paused briefly, but MacDonald's steady, "Easy now, sir, just keep moving," encouraged him onward. A sudden gust swept down the corrie, driving mist before it and momentarily obscuring Holmes from view. I heard the rattle of dislodged stones and his sharp exclamation, but when the vapour cleared he was still there, unmoved, continuing his deliberate advance. The incident served as a salutary reminder of nature's impartial peril. No malice directed against us, merely the ancient indifference of mountain and weather. At last, after what seemed an age but could scarcely have been more than 15 minutes, Holmes reached the wider platform before the cave mouth. He turned, bracing himself against the rock, and called back encouragement as I completed the final meters. One by one we joined him, the Count pale but composed, MacDonald impassive as ever, until all four stood safely upon the sheltered shelf, the treacherous ledge behind us. Holmes allowed himself a brief, satisfied smile. "Well done, gentlemen. The most formidable guardian of our Roman secret has been passed. Nature sets sterner tests than any criminal mind I have encountered." We rested momentarily, uncoiling the rope and catching our breath while the wind howled past the cave entrance. The drop we had traversed now appeared even more appalling in retrospect, the loch a mere black ribbon far below, half veiled in drifting mist. Yet the intellectual triumph of having reached this point unscathed outweighed the physical trial. The parchment's final riddle lay solved before us, and the cave yawned invitingly in the granite face. With lanterns lit against the gathering gloom within, Holmes led the way into the fissure, his eager step betraying the excitement that the peril had momentarily suppressed. We followed, leaving the wild Highland afternoon behind and stepping into the darkness that had guarded its secret for 17 centuries. The cave into which we stepped was a narrow fissure in the granite, widening gradually into a low chamber some 20 feet across and perhaps twice as long. The air within was cold and still, carrying the faint earthy scent of undisturbed stone and the subtle mineral tang of ancient water. Our lanterns cast wavering circles of yellow light upon the rough walls, revealing streaks of quartz that glittered like frost and patches of lichen clinging stubbornly to the rock. The floor was uneven, strewn with fallen fragments and a thin layer of silt, deposited by occasional floods in ages past. Holmes, lantern held high, advanced with that silent cat-like tread which characterized his movements in moments of intense concentration. His eyes, bright with anticipation, swept the chamber systematically, floor, walls, ceiling, missing nothing. The rest of us followed more cautiously, MacDonald bringing up the rear with the crowbar and a coil of spare rope. "Observe," said Holmes quietly, directing his light toward the far wall. The final marker, the Roman eagle. There, faintly incised into the granite at shoulder height, was the unmistakable outline of an aquila, wings outstretched, beak fierce, the sacred standard of a legion. The carving was weathered but deliberate, executed with the precision of a military engineer rather than the crude strokes of a tribesman. Beneath it, the floor showed signs of disturbance, a slight depression where the silt lay thinner, as though something had been pressed into the earth centuries ago. Holmes knelt, brushing aside the loose debris with his gloved hand. "Here," he murmured, "a flagged stone, carefully shaped to fit the natural contour. Watson, your lantern, if you please." I held the light steady while he worked the crowbar beneath the edge of the slab. The stone lifted with surprising ease, revealing a shallow cavity lined with smaller flat rocks, a deliberate construction rather than a natural hollow. Within lay a cylindrical object, dull grey in the lantern glow, a lead pot, about 10 inches in diameter and sealed with a fitted lid, its surface pitted by time but intact. The Count drew a sharp breath. Preserved after all these centuries. Holmes lifted the pot with reverent care, it was heavier than its size suggested, and set it upon a flat boulder. With delicate precision he pried at the lead seal, which yielded after a moment's resistance, the ancient metal crumbling softly. The lid came free, and we crowded closer as he tilted the lantern to illuminate the contents. Within lay a compact mass of silver coins, packed tightly and separated by thin layers of what appeared to be decayed leather, perhaps the remnants of individual purses. Holmes carefully extracted the uppermost layer, revealing coins that gleamed as though freshly struck. They were denarii of the highest quality, silver bright and untarnished, edges crisp, portraits and inscriptions sharp enough to read by lamplight. "Remarkable preservation," he said, turning one coin to the light. "Trajan, deified, with the legend Divs Trians. And here, Hadrian, note the fine portraiture. Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, a deliberate selection, one or two of the finest issues from each reign, continuing through Septimius Severus and Caracalla to Severus Alexander. No later emperors, consistent with concealment during Severus's final Caledonian campaign of AD 208 to 211. He continued to lift them out carefully, counting as he went. In all, the pot contained perhaps 250 pieces, not a vast imperial payroll, but a meticulously curated collection, as though assembled by a discerning officer for personal or diplomatic purposes. The monetary value was modest by modern standards, yet their historical significance was incalculable, a pristine snapshot of Roman imperial portraiture across a century, hidden far beyond the frontier and untouched since the day it was buried. The Count, his pale face illuminated by the lantern's glow, examined several pieces with trembling fingers. "Magnificent," he whispered. "A treasure not of gold, but of history itself. Mr. Holmes, you have surpassed all expectation." Holmes replaced the coins with equal care, resealing the pot as best he could with strips of cloth from our packs. "The hoard is yours by right of inheritance, Count. But I confess I share your sentiment. Such a collection belongs not in private hands, but where scholars and the public may study it." The Count straightened, his decision evident in his expression. "Then it shall go to the National Museums of Scotland, intact and entire. I shall arrange it upon our return. Let it be known as the Draculea Highland Hoard, a testament to Roman ambition and to the ingenuity that has recovered it after 1700 years. We lingered only long enough to sketch the eagle carving and note the chamber's dimensions before preparing to withdraw. The lanterns flickered as we turned toward the entrance, casting long shadows that danced upon the walls like spirits of the ancient past, reluctantly yielding their secret. The intellectual triumph was complete. From faded parchment in a London sitting room to this hidden cache in the heart of Caledonia, every clue had led us unerringly to the truth. Yet the most perilous part of our return still lay ahead. The retracing of that treacherous ledge with our precious burden safely secured. The return traverse of the ledge, with the lead pot securely roped to Holmes's pack and the knowledge of its priceless contents weighing upon us all, proved even more trying to the nerves than the outward journey. The sun had dipped behind the western peaks, casting the corrie into deep shadow, and a colder wind now swept down from the snowfields, carrying fine particles of ice that stung the face like needles. Yet the same disciplined caution that had served us before saw us safely across, Holmes leading with unerring steadiness, myself following, then the Count, and MacDonald last, paying out the rope with practiced skill. Not a word was spoken until all four of us stood once more upon the solid ground of the corrie floor. Only then did the Count permit himself a long exhalation of relief, and even MacDonald, usually impassive, allowed a brief, "Aye, that was a close thing." We made our way down to the ponies in the gathering dusk, the mist now thick about the lower slopes and the first stars pricking through overhead. The descent to Aviemore seemed almost leisurely after the perils of the cliff, and by lantern light we reached the inn well after nightfall. A roaring fire, hot broth, and a dram of whisky restored our spirits, and there, in the low-ceilinged parlour, we examined the hoard more thoroughly by lamplight. The coins, spread upon a clean white cloth, confirmed Holmes's earlier assessment. A curated selection of the finest denarii from Trajan to Severus Alexander, each piece in extraordinary condition. The Count repeated his intention to present the entire collection to the nation, and telegrams were dispatched to Edinburgh arranging for its formal reception. Our southward journey commenced 2 days later, the weather having turned milder with a soft thaw that made the roads heavy but passable. We travelled by carriage to Perth, thence by rail through the lowlands and borders, retracing in reverse the ancient Roman arteries we had followed north. The hoard, carefully packed in a locked case, rested upon the seat between Holmes and the Count, a silent testament to the success of our quest. Conversation during those long hours in the railway carriage turned reflective. The Count spoke movingly of his family's long stewardship of the parchment and his satisfaction that its secret had at last been honourably resolved. Holmes, puffing thoughtfully at his pipe, discoursed upon the broader implications of the find. The hoard fills a significant lacuna in our knowledge of Roman activity north of the Antonine Wall, he observed. The selection of coins, imperial portraits only, no republican or provincial issues, suggests it was assembled by a high-ranking officer, perhaps as a diplomatic gift to secure the allegiance of Caledonian chieftains during Severus's campaign. That it was concealed rather than delivered implies the failure of that policy and perhaps the death of its bearer in the retreat southward. I remarked upon the extraordinary chain of deduction that had led us from a faded parchment in Baker Street to that remote Highland cave. "A straightforward matter of observation and synthesis, Watson," Holmes replied modestly. "Yet I confess this affair has afforded me peculiar satisfaction. There was no criminal antagonist, no melodrama of pursuit or violence, only the pure intellectual challenge of an ancient riddle, coupled with the stern but honest peril of the mountain itself. In an age when crime grows ever more sordid and mechanical, it is refreshing to pit one's faculties against the indifference of nature and the silence of centuries." We reached London on a wet evening, the familiar yellow fog once more enfolding the metropolis. Count Draculea remained only long enough to oversee the formal transfer of the hoard to representatives of the National Museums of Scotland, who had travelled south for the purpose. The presentation took place with due ceremony at the British Museum, where the coins, now known as the Draculea Highland hoard, were placed on temporary display before their permanent removal to Edinburgh. The Count departed for Bucharest shortly thereafter, bearing with him Holmes's cordial invitation to call again should any further enigma present itself. "Though I trust," Holmes added with a smile, "that it will involve less precipitous terrain." Thus ended the adventure of the Caledonian cache, one of the most tranquil yet intellectually rewarding episodes in my friend's career. No shots were fired, no desperate struggle enacted. The only dangers were those inherent in the wild Highland landscape, and the only triumph, that of reason over time. In later years, when visitors to the National Museums of Scotland pause before the gleaming silver denarii displayed in their glass case, Few perhaps realize that they owe their presence there to the acute reasoning and quiet courage of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For my own part, I look back upon those December days in the Cairngorms with a peculiar fondness. The mist-wreathed peaks, the perilous ledge, the ancient cave yielding its long-guarded secret, as a reminder that the greatest treasures are often not of gold or jewels, but of knowledge preserved and understanding gained.